Sweet are the promises, kind is the word, dearer far than any message man ever heard. Pure was the mind of Christ, sinless I see. He the great example is a pattern for me. Where is our God? He's the follow Jesus every day. Sweet is the nectar of Jesus the show, sweeter far than any love that mortals have known. Kind to the erring one, faithful is he. He's the great example, is a pattern for me. Where is our God? He's a follow Jesus every day. Listen to his loving word, come unto me. Weary, heavy laden, there is sweet rest for me. Trust in his promises, faithful and sure. Lean upon the Savior, and my soul is secure. Where is our God? He's a follow his way. Where is our God? He's a follow Jesus every day. Page 535, 535. I'm in the way, the bright and shining way. I'm in the glory and way. Telling the world that Jesus is today. Yes, I'm in the glory and way. I'm in the glory and way. I'm in the glory and way. And love is nearer and glory grows clearer. For I'm in the glory and way. Listen to the call of gospel call today. Get in the glory land way. Wanderers come home, oh, listen to obey. For I'm in the glory land way. I'm in the glory land way. I'm in the glory land way. Heaven is here and the way groweth clear. For I'm in the glory land way. Onward I go, rejoicing in his love. I'm in the glory land way. Soon I shall see him in that home of love. Oh, I'm in the glory land way. I'm in the glory land way. I'm in the glory land way. Heaven is here and the way groweth clearer. For I'm in the glory land way. Mark in your songbooks, page 902. 902. I told somebody after I put that on the computer and I saw that, that's the way I titled it, and I could say,
oh, there's some over there, and there's some right there, and there's some down here. You know, if you use dead in a different definition, dead in their sins. But that's always a question that seems to come up to people, and a lot of things that are said sometimes that doesn't really seem to fit when we hear people talk about the dead and things that are concerning. So a couple things that were brought up and to me, and I figured I'd explore them a little bit, share them. I thought about not doing this. Kept trying to talk myself out of doing this because of recent events. Was the timing good or anything? But my mind just kept going back to it, so I figured if I don't get it done, go ahead and get it done, it's just gonna hang in there. So, but here's an interesting point, and the thing that we ought to do and ought to realize, because a lot of the world, religious world even, doesn't understand, even though they claim to believe the scriptures, what the Bible says about the dead and where they are and what happens. In Ecclesiastes 12:6-7, it says, remember your Creator, for the silver cord is loose, or the golden bowl is broken, or the pitcher shattered at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the well. What's he talking about there in verse 6? Old age. Part of it's old age, but really at the end, he's saying at the end, before everything's over, worth dead. I mean, when you sit there and think about the silver cord is loose or gold bowl is broken, you're thinking a lot about older age. But, you know, think about that pitcher shattered at the fountain or the wheel broken at the well.
War.
Huh?
War.
War, anything, any kind of accident could bring about that, or sometimes not even an accident. So it said, huh?
Worn out, yeah.
Worn out, broken, it's like I remember very well, right after we graduated from high school, right after the summer was over, first football the next season, a good friend of mine's little brother got killed in a car wreck. He wasn't driving, it was a single car accident, but they flipped that truck. And somehow he came out of that truck. And the truck ended up landing on him. On the way they found him, somebody tripped over his feet. 18 years old, or not even 18 years old. So at that point, that wheel was broken. Here's the big question, because one thing we sit there and we see, and we're going to get to it, and our question is, where are they? But the one thing we see in that is the dust returns to ground and the spirit returns to God. Now, the part that continues living is what we're going to examine where it is. Because the body, obviously, goes back to dust. Okay? Now, big question is that we're going to start with, because this is the point, have they been judged? Why does have they been judged have a bearing on where they're at?
Rich man, Lazarus story.
We'll be getting there. But that's a big part of it, because most of the time when we hear people, especially at funerals, sometimes, and they're in heaven. That's what we'll hear people say, they're in heaven. Well, if they're in heaven, what has to have happened? They've had been judged. So the question is, has judgment taken place? That's really what we're. Notice it says here, and this is the New King James Version, and as it is appointed for men to die once, but after this the judgment. So Christ was offered once to bear the sins of many. To those who eagerly wait for him, he will appear a second time apart from sin for salvation. Now the ESV says, and just as it's appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment. So that kind of leads an avenue like, okay, do they die and then comes judgment, or do they gotta wait for the judgment? And I got to looking, and I went to my trusty old American Standard, because it's closer to the Greek, and then I went and looked up the Greek, and the ESV is close to right. That definite article there of the judgment is not in the Greek. That the is not in the Greek. But it's in King James and New King James. But most other translations have that comes judgment or judgment comes. So it kind of leaves it open. But I want you to notice something. Look at context, because context means a lot. Look at verse 28. So Christ was offered once to bear the sins of many. To those who eagerly wait for him, he will appear a second time apart from sin for our salvation. How many times was he offered? How many times is he going to appear?
He has once.
Well, he appeared once, but how many? Okay, let me rephrase. How many times will he appear again? Once. So that starts looking like if the judge, if he's only going to appear once, judgment has come once. I wanted some things that we looked at last week, but we're going to look at a little briefer this week. In chapter 1 Thessalonians 4, 15, 17, for this we say to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive remain will, until the coming of the Lord will by no means precede those who are asleep. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of an archangel, with the trumpet of God, and the dead, when Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. Thus we shall always be with the Lord. Here's the question. If they're judged and they're in heaven, why haven't they yet resurrected? Now, Paul says we're not going to precede them if we're still here on the earth. But he's also not saying we're going to miss it either.
My understanding of that was that's he's talking about the bodily resurrection that's in 1 Corinthians 15, not the time when you die and the spirit and the body are separated.
Right. He is talking about when they come back together. But here's the question. Now, we read in there in Ecclesiastes that it returns to God, but what does that mean, returns to God who gave it? Does that mean they go to heaven? Because if it means they go to heaven, guess what it means? If you translate that everybody in Ecclesiastes 12:7, the dead, once they die, the dust returns to dust and the spirit returns to God. Whose all spirit goes? If you put that in translation to where God is, exactly where God is.
Yeah, but that's kind of read into that.
But we'll see that's
he's
the
in
point.
heaven, so everything returns to heaven. But that's not what it says.
That's not what, and that's my point. That's not what it's talking about. That's not.
Whether he has a holding place for them at that time, or.
Well, that's where we're going to get to, but that's my point. If we start making, because if we start putting, even though we have these separate, and Paul is talking about the physical resurrection, where the body and the spirit are reunited and resurrected in that incorruptible body.
Wait, when does eternity begin?
Yeah, good question.
Or does it begin?
Well, for God, it has no beginning.
Of course, or for us.
For us,
When we die?
Or when we're resurrected, or when we die, or at judgment, or after the judgment.
well, let me put it like this. How about when you're born?
No, but we're gonna die.
The body, but will our soul die?
Well, that's right. We are eternal.
So here's the thing. We really can't put a spot on that. Here's the thing.
You see, what you're trying to do, you're trying to put timetables on things up there that may be in eternity. on timetables in eternity. There's no yesterday, today, or tomorrow, or now, or next week.
I understand what you're saying there, okay? But let me ask you this. Will there be a resurrection?
Very definitely it seems to me.
Okay, so there is a timetable.
I didn't say that. I said
Well,
there will be a
if there
resurrection.
will be a resurrection, there must be a timetable as to when. Well, let's put it like this. Let me go on, Ray. You say, see.
Just one question. What is Paul referring to in Philippians 1 when he says, I'd rather die and be with the Lord? What does that mean?
In the realm of the Lord,
In some sense, in Abraham's bosom, is that place?
that's where I would put it too, but let's get to that. Let's get to that point. But here's the thing. Now, let me stress this. I'm going to give you my study on it. You may reach a different conclusion. It doesn't necessarily make you wrong. And it doesn't necessarily make me wrong. As long as I'm using what the scriptures say. Is that fair? First Corinthians 15, 51, 52, behold, I tell you a mystery, we shall not all sleep, but we all shall all be changed in the moment of the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet, for the dead will sound, the dead will be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. There's going to be an elite few that get to skip the resurrection process, so to speak. Their body's not going to die. They're going to escape death. They're going to be changed. When will that happen?
When Jesus comes back.
At the last
When
trumpet.
Jesus comes back, the last day, the day of judgment, as we often call it. And that's the point that comes here. My point is, can we separate the judgment from the resurrection? In 2 Thessalonians 1:7-9, talking about the things that will happen to him, he says, and give you who are troubled rest with us when the Lord Jesus revealed from heaven with his mighty angels, in flaming fire, taking vengeance on those who do not know God and on those who do not obey the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. These shall be punished with everlasting destruction from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of his power. Well, there's a beginning of eternity, isn't it, Ray?
Looks like it.
Everlasting destruction.
Well, that's a continuation of him coming to the clouds. So the collective sum of that is that judgment scene, because he's going to execute punishment.
He's going to exit.
So you get the sense there of the judgment scene. Maybe it had already been judged, he just hadn't sentenced them in terms of sending them to perdition, I mean, to hell. But,
And I think you're heading down the right path. There is a presumption of guilt and then a placement of penalty.
yeah, well, we see that in the Lazarus rich man story.
The Lazarus rich man story provides time.
And-
And there's not an immediacy there, other than there's an immediacy in the initial judgment. But there's still time because it's before the resurrection. Because he's talking about folks that hadn't been resurrected yet, or hadn't died yet. So there's definitely, some time. So it's not, it's not like we lay down and take a dirt nap and wake up in 1,000 years and it's over. It's, there's something happening. Now, I don't know if time passes the same, because you're on dead time. I mean, it's different.
Well, here's the deal. He finishes when he comes in that day. But I think you've kind of got the right idea, or we're on the same page, because does the passage of time, and let's maybe say it that, right? Is there really a passage of time in death?
You don't take naps. At least we don't think you do. So,
But let me ask this question now. You brought up naps. When Lazarus was dead, the Lord said he sleeps.
Okay.
But what was he talking about? What part of him was sleeping?
Physical.
The physical. Now, we know it wasn't necessarily the soul. Now, but at that point, what happens when you sleep?
dream.
How do you experience time?
A lot faster.
A lot faster? Sometimes faster, sometimes slower, sometimes it varies.
I've had a day, I've had a whole day in dream.
But my point I'm trying to say is, when you're sleeping, there's really no passage of time. You wouldn't know time to pass except when you wake up and you look at the clock.
But he had a sense of urgency about his friend, his family. So time was passing and he
But
was
you're
aware of it through,
You're talking about Lazarus,
Rich
or
man
the rich
Lazarus,
man Lazarus.
yeah.
We're talking about Lazarus
okay.
that Jesus raised from the dead, Mary and Martha's brother. But there was a point that he was concerned with what was going on back here. Okay? But how much time was he going to actually experience lapse? Is it years? Is it months? Is it days? I mean, what are we saying? When we've been there 10,000 years?
Well, in Revelation, the martyrs under the throne kept saying, how long? So they were experiencing some kind of time.
Well, was it the time, or was just saying, Lord, when are you going to do this? When are you going to avenge us? I'm going to give you a little deal. In Ray's question, I actually believe eternity begins with death. Because that's when we start to experience it.
We're programmed so completely from birth till we die with time that we can more really grasp eternity, the concept of eternity, than we can be grasping the size of the universe. You just can't do it because we're programmed. Everything we do in this life, everything revolves around time.
And you're right, because we're programmed to it, because we're constantly reminded of it.
Of course.
But what about if there were no reminder?
Well, we wouldn't be asked.
Have you ever lost a day?
Yeah.
Or two, or a week or so? You know? Back in 2010, Alex and I were riding motorcycles through the Grand Canyon, and we're going along, and we're getting there, and we get in New Mexico, and we're signing into a hotel, and the guy sit there, and I said, no, today's Friday. He said, no, it's Saturday. No, today's Friday. Now, our plan was to be in Hopi, Arizona on Saturday. Guess where that was? That was on the other side of New Mexico, about 100 miles. And guess what? We even knew where we were going to go to church next morning. When I finally sit there and look at my phone and realize, you know what, today is Saturday. We lost a day somewhere. Guess what my next thought was? I got to find a place to worship. But what would have happened if the guy hadn't mentioned that today was Saturday?
You woke upstairs Friday?
I'd have went on thinking it was Friday. Got up the next day and Saturday. Why? Because I hadn't had a reminder. We constantly remind ourselves of time. Birthdays, anniversaries, graduation dates. The other day, somebody said something. I said, oh, that wasn't that long ago. 42 years. Here's the question, and this is what I want to get to the point. In this point about being judged, if the judge takes place and resurrection are tied together, could we have missed it? See, here's the point that Paul makes in preaching about the resurrection. Now, if Christ is preaching has been raised from the dead, how do some among you say there is no resurrection of the dead? But if there is no resurrection of the dead, then Christ is not risen. If Christ is not risen, then our preaching is empty and your faith is also empty. There's a thing called the AD 70 doctrine. And what it claims is that Jesus came again in AD 70 when he destroyed the temple. And that the judgment scene talked about in Revelation took place then. And all people who die either go to heaven or to hell immediately. And this is taught in the church. Now, here's the question. If that be the case, where's the resurrection?
In the past, is that?
In the past. And it means, guess what? Just as these people are saying there is no resurrection, and like Paul was talking about those people, obviously, right in 1 Thessalonians 4, the question was, will there be a resurrection? Will the dead,
Hymenaeus and one of the others were preaching that the resurrection had already taken place.
that it had already taken place. So if it's already taken place, what happens? See, here's the point. If the resurrection has already taken place, what guarantee we have of being together with the Lord? And that it's kind of the exact opposite of what Paul is preaching out here. Here he said if Christ is not, if there is no resurrection, Christ is not risen, but Christ is risen. Now, here's the thing: if there's no hope of a resurrection for us, what's the point?
That's what that heresy does, is it takes away your hope.
It does. It takes away your hope. And it takes that point away, and it's actually a contradiction. Let's go ahead and look at Revelation. John says, "Then I saw a great white throne, and him who sat on it, from whose face the earth and heaven fled away, and there was found no place for them. And I saw the dead, small and great, standing before God, and books were opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged according to their works by the things which were written in the books. The sea gave up the dead who were in it, and death and Hades delivered up the dead who were in them, and they were judged, each one according to his works. Then death and Hades were cast in the lake of fire. This is the second death, and anyone not found written in the book of life was cast in the lake of fire." Now, part of the AD 70 doctrine says, see, what we see in Luke chapter 16, which we're going to be getting to, hopefully, isn't anymore because that was all cast in the lake of fire. And so everything just is determined. You go where you're going, really not facing judgment, but being judged, but determine where you go. Here's the problem with that. Let's go back one. Look at verse 11. What right there tells me the resurrection and the judgment cannot have taken place yet? Very first verse. Earth still here. What John saw was so far in the future that the earth had been destroyed.
And the other verse that you had up there in Revelation, death and Hades are spoken of in the same context as like the sea. So death is a place, and Hades is a place, because they're going to deliver up the dead who are in them. So some of the dead are in one of those three places right there.
Well, literally, the sea is just sitting there telling you that it doesn't matter where your body goes, it's going to be given up. A lot of people, the idea, and this was something that was early in the first century and on for several years, and even today, is that if a body is cremated, there's nothing there to be resurrected. And our earth thought today, people that were buried at sea would not be resurrected, because their bodies would most likely be consumed by the marine life. So John and God through the Holy Spirit is basically telling you is, it really don't matter where your body ends up or what kind of shape it's in, it's going to get resurrected. Now, you're right, death and Hades are places. And they're two separate places.
Two separate places. That's odd, because we don't think of death as a place.
But it is a state. It is what, where is the body? When we die, what happens to the body? In fact, let me rephrase that. What part of us dies?
Physical.
The physical body. The physical body is what goes into death. And as we read, the spirit returns to God in heaven. So there's that point there that we should start to realize that these are two different places, and those two places are going to be destroyed. Now, when he talks about there that death and Hades are cast in the lake of fire, that means there's no place for the body to go to other than with the spirit. In Hades, there's no realm of the dead. That's literally what Hades means.
Can I ask something?
Yes.
In the beginning of this sentence, sea is not capitalized, but death and Hades are. So wouldn't that mean that the sea is a place, but because it's not, it's just confusing me on places and names.
It is. The sea is more reference not just of the sea, but of the ground itself. Death is the state which the body is in. Hades is the place where the spirit resides. Does that make sense to you?
Okay.
I guess they separated, they said that because there were so many people that thought that the sea was some other place. You know, that it was, like it didn't count.
Yeah. And there was, I thought, a lot of superstition, a lot of ideas even today. I know a lot of people that will tell you it's a sin to cremate a body. So what about people that get killed in a fire? I had a friend that was in Vietnam. He got to tell me stories one night. He said, "Do you think that idea when you see on movies and stuff, that pop of a mortar tube, is it real?" I said, "It's real." He says, "You hear that and you go jumping to try to hide." Told about how they jumped off a bridge, and then he went to try to find the comrade that was in front of him, the friend that was there. All they found was his shoe. Mortar round, hit him dead center. Virtually disintegrated. Can God resurrect that? Absolutely. That's where the thoughts get into idea. They start limiting on what God can do.
Yeah, we're getting living on the wrong end of the stick.
Yeah. And it's funny, the answer is always in God's word.
He does his best work when he does.
He does. You know?
And nothing.
So in this point, you know, there has to be a point that the judgment cannot have been taken place. The judgment day. Because the reality of it is, for people to be in heaven, it's going to be the resurrected people in heaven. about Jesus. Where did he spend his 3 days when he was in the grave? I got your favorite version up there, Ray. King James. Acts 2:30, verse 32. Therefore, being a prophet and knowing that God has sworn with an oath to him that of the fruit of his loins, according to the flesh, he would raise up Christ and sit on his throne, as talking about David. He, seeing this before, spake of the resurrection of Christ, that his soul was not left in hell, neither his flesh did see corruption. Thus Jesus hath God raised up, whereof we are all witnesses. Now, don't anybody go jumping to the cross on me yet, okay? There is a doctrine that says Jesus spent 3 days literally in hell. In order to make atonement for our sins, he had to suffer what we would suffer if we did. And it comes from this right here in the Psalms, the translation. You ever read 1 Corinthians 13, and Paul says, when I was a child, I spake as a child. Understanding is something that comes with growth. What happens when we first learn a language, a foreign language? Sometimes, really, when we get into school and we first learn English, how confused do we get sometimes? Do we? How many words have different meanings?
Most of them.
Okay? Now, you think about a dead language like Koine Greek and a living language like English, and people who did not understand Koine Greek fully, trying to translate it into English. Are they going to understand there's different, and they're being taught about hell, and are they going to understand there's different words, meaning different things, or different meanings? Not necessarily. Here in the New King James, verses 25 through 28, quotes what David said concerning him. I foresaw the Lord always before my face, for he is at my right hand, that I may not be shaken. Therefore my heart rejoiced, my tongue is glad, moreover my flesh also will rest in hope. For you will not leave my soul in Hades, nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption. You have made known to me the ways of your life. You will make me full of joy in your presence. Now, Peter says David was not talking about himself. He was talking about the Lord. Now, if there's a difference between Hades and hell, does it change where Jesus spent his time?
Can you go back to the Greek or anything and see that they should have put Hades instead of hell? Okay.
It is. It wasn't intentional or anything. It was just from their understanding. Now, what people did with it, especially even in modern times, is where the problem came in.
But Sheol is what
Fixing to show you that.
okay.
Psalm 16:8-10 in the King James Version, right? Peter quotes, I have set the Lord always before me, because he is at my right hand. I shall not be moved. Therefore my heart is glad, and my voice, my flesh shall also rest in hope. For thou wilt not leave my soul in hell, neither wilt thou suffer thine Holy One to see corruption. Now, you got to understand, here they're translating Hebrew to English. In Acts, they're translating Greek to English. So they're trying to get the mass come together. And one thing that's not always alluded to is that when the King James scholars were translating this Old Testament of Hebrew, they were relying a lot on the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. So guess what the Greek translation did with the Old Testament? It translated this to Hades. Their understanding of Hades was hell, just another name for hell. That's what they understood about the culture of the time. So that's why they translated. But now, once you look at these two together, King James versus New King James. Verse 10, you will not leave my soul in hell, you will not leave my soul in Sheol. Starts making a little difference there, does it? Or does it? You go through my New King James Bible, you find Sheol at a lot of places. Now, here is two things I found in translations. One, it gives you the pronunciation Sheol, and then it gives you the Hebrew spelling of it. And if you are trying to spell that right to left, or left to right, no, you actually have to go to the last letter and go back the other way. Hebrew is written right to left, not left to right. I found that out as I scrolled across it and jumped back over. Notice in the Hebrew Bible is a place of darkness which today go, under some circumstances, they are thought to be able to be contacted by the living. Sheol is also called Hades in the Greek. This is actually from Wikipedia, that part. This other part is from Eastman's Bible Dictionary. The all-demanding world, Hades, the unknown region, the invisible world of departed souls. Sheol, Hades, literally Sheol is the grave, or grave area. And it refers to where the soul goes in the grave. Hades, it says, is literally in Greek, the realm of the dead. It is an invisible world. Do we see it? Okay. So if Jesus was in Sheol, that's different from being in hell. And here's the reason. Notice this point. In Luke 23:39-43, then one of the criminals who were hanged blasphemed him, saying, if you are the Christ, save yourself and us. But the other answering rebuked him, saying, do you not even fear God, seeing you are under the same condemnation, and we indeed justly? For we receive the due reward of our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong. Then he said to Jesus, Lord, remember me when you come in your kingdom. And Jesus said to him, surely I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. Our problem we get into is we want to put the grave into one lump place. Could there be two parts? And here's reality. Either this has to be right, or if Hades is divided up into paradise, and then we'll see Luke, a place of torment, then Acts 2 being translated Hades fits, because Jesus was in the grave, and his body did not see corruption. Unlike ours, he wasn't raised from dust, he was raised as he had died. He had the nail prints, as Thomas found. He had the pierce in his side. And yet he could still be in paradise with the thief that was forgiven. Does that make sense?
Peter said, he was still able to go and preach to the dead.
That's a whole.
Okay, because they could communicate from one side of one side of the chasm to the other. They could communicate back and forth, but the one with Lazarus was in Abraham's bosom, whereas the rich man was in torment.
Right, and we'll get there in a little bit, but there's that point, yeah, he was there to preach to them. And in fact, that preaching there is making an affirmation of why they should have listened to Noah. Now, paradise cannot be heaven. Now, I will not say heaven is not going to be a paradise, but this place cannot be heaven. And here's why. In John 20:16-17, Jesus said to her, Mary. She turned and said to him, Rabboni, which is say teacher. This is the resurrection day. This is the day of his resurrection when Mary Magdalene is in the garden and she's looking for Jesus and she's thinking he's a gardener, says to him, if you know where they put the Lord, my Lord, tell me. And this is the conversation. And notice what he said. Jesus said to her, do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father. But go to my brethren and say to them, I am ascended to my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God. If paradise is heaven, wouldn't he have already been ascended to the Father?
What you're bringing up, from what I can see, is something that to me has been called limbo, in between.
And what you're talking about in limbo is not limbo is a state in where you don't know what's going to happen.
Okay.
That's more like purgatory.
I wasn't thinking of it like that, but I think I get where you're going. I just don't know.
But there's a place there. Let's put it like this: when you go to see the doctor, what do you first have to do?
Wait.
Got to go in the waiting room.
That's why you're fine.
That's where we're going. There's a waiting place.
They separate the sick ones from the COVID.
Ron said where they separate the sick from the COVID. Kind of true there, yeah.
Actually, they make you go out and wait in your car now. They don't even let you stay in the waiting room.
Sometimes they think when you go up
Everything changed.
that you might have COVID, they don't even let you get out of the car. Casey had to take a test and they didn't even let her out of the car. The doctor put on all the guard and came out through the car. Okay, so let's try and tie this up together and get into Luke chapter 16. Verses 19 to 23. There was a certain rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen and fared sumptuously every day, but there was a certain beggar named Lazarus, full of sores, who was laid at his gate, desiring to be fed with the crumbs which fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, the dogs came to lick his sores. What we want to understand about these first three verses are talking about why they ended up where they did. Especially the rich man. So it was that the beggar died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died and was buried, and being in torments in Hades, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham afar off and Lazarus in his bosom. Who is Abraham? What title is he been given?
Father of the faithful.
Father of the faithful. Where would you expect Abraham to be? Just in limbo or in paradise? And this one being in torment in Hades, and that's one of the problems we get into. We like, okay, well, Hades has got to be a form of hell. But in the Greek, Hades would have simply meant the realm of the dead. So 2 parts. Here we go. The world is where we're at. Sheol or Hades, place of the dead, is divided into 2 parts. Paradise and torment, and then there's a great fixed gulf. As it flares out in the scripture, you can't pass from one to the other. Okay? The difference is on this side of death, the lost can become the saved, and the saved can become the lost. Jesus said, enter in by the narrow gate, and wide is the gate that leads to destruction. But if it is only the spirits that are there of man, whichever one they are, they have not yet to be judged. Or they have yet to be judged. We'll fix it.
Is there fire in Hades?
Well, the rich man said, I am tormented in this flame.
Is that the hell, or is that the half hell?
Well, this is the hell where you know where things are going to get worse. If you think this is bad, wait till that. Okay, here's a question.
That's just a preheat of it.
A preheat oven. I like the word pre because it's kind of a prejudgment. You won't think about this. The rich man asked Abraham for Lazarus to come dip his finger. And Abraham kind of says, wait a minute, this is why you're over there. You remember how you received good things and Lazarus bad things? Now you're receiving the bad things and Lazarus good things. And then he talks about the gulf being fixed. That even if he wanted to see Lazarus over there, he couldn't. What?
Part of the torment was seeing Lazarus.
Part of the torment was seeing Lazarus. Okay? Now, here's the thing. What do we know about heaven? Revelation 21, 5-8, this is after the judge scene. Then he who sat on the throne said, behold, I make all things new. And he said to me, write, for these words are true and faithful. And he said to me, it is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. I will give of the fountain of water of life freely to him who thirsts. He who overcomes shall inherit all things, and I will be his God, and he shall be my son. When we're in heaven, where are we going to be? In the presence of God. What about everybody in hell? But the cowardly, unbelieving, abominable, murderers, sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death.
Jesus pointed about your last slide and about that topic of the old paradise and the torment. You can't cross from one place to the other. You pass through those gates and you can't go back the other way. In a sense, that's already a judgment in and of itself.
Prejudgment. Prejudgment. What happens at judgment?
I think that's the difference between the two of us, what happens, you know, where you.
Well, there is a little thing there.
You get a little higher.
I got a feeling.
Part and a hotter place in hell, or.
Well, I don't think it's really that much difference in it, other than where you're at and a point. I can't answer that. Like Joe and I were talking this afternoon. Some of this, the only way we're going to really be able to explain it is to get there. You know, and unfortunately, those who have been there
Ain't coming back.
Well, they didn't say anything when they did come back. All those people in the New Testament and Old Testament we read about, if they told anybody, it was to what people they know, and it died with them.
And none of them came back from the lower one on that. option for that.
Yeah, the only we got is what the rich man says. And notice he's unnamed. So we get to that point, my son separated. Notice, now here's it, Matthew 25. When Jesus is talking about the different men getting the various sums of money, it says, and then the kingdom of heaven will be like. And the one that did nothing with the money, it says, and cast the unprofitable servant into outer darkness, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, in the place of torment, they could see over into paradise. Guess what hell does? Takes you so far away you can't see it. You'll get a glimpse at judgment. You'll get a glimpse of heaven. But you won't get to enter in. Notice chapter 25, verse 41. When he will say to those who are on the left, and depart from me, you cursed, into the everlasting fire prepared for the devil and his angels. You know what context this is? It says, when he comes again, he will separate the sheep from the goats. And he goes through all those people and tells them, when I was hungry, you fed me. When I was thirsty, they said, Lord, when did we do it? And they've already been told they're going in. He says, because when I was hungry. What? You acted like a Christian. You were a Christian. And then that other group, he turns around, apart from him. And he goes on to say, for when I was thirsty, you gave me no drink. When I was hungry, you gave me no food. See the difference there? What happens at judgment? There are going to be a lot of people in Hades that are trying to figure out, how did I end up here? How did I get there? But it's not going to be until the judgment day they get the full explanation. I got this slide from West Palm Beach, Lakes Church of Christ. David Spew preaches. I got a feeling he probably made this slide, but anyway. He uses hell and Hades, here and death, because of both the translations. Puts it waiting for judgment in paradise. Taking this context, Luke 16, 19 through 31. And then he looks at hells and Hades on the other side, apart from that gulf, waiting for judgment and torment. It's kind of like having a preliminary hearing. And the judge says, well, I'm not so sure if you're guilty, so I'm going to give you bail. And well, it's a little different from that, but that's my analogy. You get bail. You're good enough that we're going to give you bail. But then the flip the other side over, we got so much evidence against you, you're going to sit here and rot until we have your trial. Until you have your judgment. Both of them are going to face judgment. Those that are out on bail get to go to heaven, so to speak. Those that don't get bail end up in hell. It's that same aspect of reality that you're in a prejudged state. Things are going to either get better or they're going to get worse. And if you're not in the better place, things aren't going to get any better. We'll finish with this one. Because it's interesting, some of this I got from people who were, and used this, and then tried to use the sinner's prayer as a way of salvation. I'm not saying some of this, most of this is my own material, but there were glimpses and stuff as I looked. Notice this in 7:21-23. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven. You know what I've always thought about when I read that verse? Not everybody that calls upon the Lord is going to enter into the kingdom of heaven just because they call upon the Lord.
You talk the talk, but you didn't walk the walk.
You talk the talk, but you didn't walk the walk. And that's what really Matthew 25 bears out. And he says, many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, cast out demons in your name, and done many wondrous things? What day? What day is he talking about?
Judgment.
Day of judgment. See, again, many people will be in torment and saying, why am I in torment? Why am I being condemned, Lord? Did I not do all these things? He says, and then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. Why? Because they did not do the will of the Father in heaven. That's just like those that he condemns in Matthew 25:41. That didn't feed him, didn't clothe him, didn't give him drink, didn't visit him, didn't do all those things that were needful, did not show brotherly love. Or better yet, did not exercise brotherly love. And isn't that basically the sum of the gospel? Obey God and love your brother as yourself.
And if you look back through history, you see a lot of lawlessness that has been done in the name of Christ.
Yeah. And you see a lot of false teaching that is done in the name of Christ.
I mean, from blowing up abortion clinics to the crusades or any of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and what you get back to is what Mama used to say, two wrongs don't make a right. Abortion clinics are wrong, but to kill people that run abortion clinics is just as wrong. And so the aspect comes back, what are we going to do? Because the truth is, there's bodies still out there in all them graves. But where are the souls? And when our time comes, where will our soul be? It doesn't matter to me a whole lot what somebody does with this old shell. What matters to me is what God does with this spirit. Because that's going to make the difference.
A mentor of mine used to tell me that this was just a shipping crate to get your spirit from cradle to grave. And it didn't matter how good of shape the shipping crate was in when it got to its destination, it was still getting thrown out.
I kind of like Paul and Peter, and along that line, tents.
And
They both use tent.
temporary shelter.
And what's the thing about a tent? It gets worn, it gets tattered, it gets patched, but it still gets worn and it gets tattered and until it's so worn out, you have to throw it out.
Not Ray's tent. It still looks real good.
Yeah, Ray's is looking good over there, his tent, but I guarantee you, if we look close enough, we'd find some patching on it. But that's what it comes back to. Where are we going to spend eternity? Sometimes people say, well, this doesn't have a lot to do with our salvation, but it does, because it's a reminder how important it is that we live for God and we obey His will. And that's what we need to do. The reality of it is, as long as we're on this side of eternity, on this side of death, we have opportunity to change. But on the other side, there's no change. It's fixed. If there's anything we can help anyone with tonight, we'd ask to come, always stand while we sing.
What can wash away my sin? Nothing but the blood of Jesus. What can make me whole again? Nothing but the blood of Jesus. Oh, precious is the flow that makes me white as snow. No other fount I know, nothing but the blood of Jesus. Nothing can for sin atone, nothing but the blood of Jesus. Not a good that I have done, nothing but the blood of Jesus. Oh, precious is the flow that makes me white as snow. No other fount I know, nothing but the blood of Jesus. Thank everyone for being here this evening. Brother Marshall, would you close us in prayer?